There are lies that are simple. And then there are lies so carefully built, over so many years, that by the time you see them for what they have become the walls of the house you are living in. Harvey Thornwell was 73 years old, a retired executive from London, a man who had managed companies, read people for a living, and prided himself on knowing when something was wrong. He never saw this one coming. For 3 years, he gave money to a woman he believed was the struggling sister of the woman he loved. The sister was not a sister. The sister was the woman he loved, in a different form, running a different life, spending everything he gave her on a world he was never meant to see. This is what he found, and this is what it cost him. The morning I found out, I was sitting in the garden of the house I rented in Quezon City. It was early, maybe 6:30. The air was still cool enough to sit outside, which it only is for about 40 minutes at that time of year, before the heat comes in like a wall. I had a cup of tea, I had my phone, and on my phone I had an image that a man named Ronaldo, a private investigator I had hired 3 weeks earlier, for reasons I could not fully explain even to myself, had sent me at 2 in the morning while I slept. The image showed 2 women at a restaurant table. One was Perla, the woman I had been with for 3 years, the woman whose voice I heard every morning and every night, the woman I had told, on a quiet evening in her apartment in Manila, that I had not felt this way since my wife died. The other woman in the photograph was Sofia. The woman I had been told was Perla's younger sister, the woman I had been sending money to for nearly the entire length of the relationship, the woman whose emergencies had become so regular that I had stopped thinking of them as emergencies and started thinking of them as simply the cost of having someone like Perla in my life. They were not sitting like sisters sit. I looked at that image for a long time, long enough that my tea went cold and the heat came in and I was still sitting there, not moving, not making a sound, not because I could not process what I was seeing, because I could process it perfectly, because all at once, in the space of one photograph taken through a restaurant window at night, the 3 years I had spent believing in something rearranged themselves into an entirely different shape, and the new shape made a horrible, complete sense that the old one never quite had. My name is Harvey Thornwell. I am 73 years old and I spent 31 years as a senior executive in the logistics sector, which is not a glamorous industry but one that requires a particular kind of intelligence. The ability to see how systems connect, how things move, how money flows through a structure, and where the points of failure are likely to emerge. I was good at my work. I retired at 68 with a strong pension and savings that I had managed carefully across a long career. I had a house in Chiswick that my wife Eleanor and I had lived in for 24 years. Eleanor died of a stroke in 2018. She was 67. We had no children, which was a choice we made early in our marriage and stood by, and which I did not regret until the years after she died, when I understood for the first time what it meant to be alone without any particular structure that obligated you to keep moving. I sold the Chiswick house in 2020, not because I needed to, but because I could not find a reason to stay in it. Every room had a version of Eleanor in it that I had not put there. She was simply present in the proportions of the kitchen, the particular light in the hallway, the garden she had tended with the kind of quiet devotion she brought to everything. I could not grieve properly with her everywhere. I moved to a flat in Kensington, kept a smaller amount liquid, invested the rest, and began the business of working out what retirement actually looked like for a man of my background and temperament, when the person he had expected to spend it with was gone. I traveled, which is what people in my position do. Not in the tourist sense. I had no interest in guided tours or all-inclusive resorts. I went to places I had never been, and stayed long enough to understand them a little. Vietnam for 5 weeks, Japan for a month, Thailand for 6 weeks, across 2 separate trips, and then, in the spring of 2021, the Philippines, on the recommendation of a former colleague named Patrick Selby, who had retired there 2 years earlier, and seemed, on the occasions we spoke, genuinely settled in a way I had not seen him in 30 years of knowing him. Patrick lived in Makati. I stayed with him for the first week, and then moved to a serviced apartment in the same area, when it became clear I was going to stay longer than I had planned. The city caught me in a way I had not expected. Not the noise or the chaos, which would have bothered the younger version of me. Something else. A quality of life at street level that felt very present. People existing in their circumstances without the particular detachment I had grown used to in London, where everyone moves through the city as though slightly upstream from it. Manila was not upstream from anything, it was in the water. I met Perla Dallasay at a dinner party Patrick hosted in late April. She was 38 years old, a marketing consultant who worked with several mid-sized retail brands in Manila, and she had the quality that I have always found most compelling in a person: the ability to be completely still in the middle of a conversation, not passive. Still, the kind of stillness that means someone is genuinely listening rather than waiting for their turn. She was not the most obviously striking woman in the room. She was the one I was still thinking about the following morning. We had dinner together 4 days later, just the two of us, at a restaurant she knew in BGC. She asked about my career, and listened to the answer with the kind of focus that makes a man feel like what he is saying matters. She talked about her own work with a practicality I respected. No false modesty, no exaggeration, just a clear account of what she did and what it required and what she was still trying to figure out. She was direct about her circumstances. She lived alone in a rented flat in a part of Manila that was decent but not wealthy. She had grown up in Pangasinan, the second of 4 children, and had worked her way into a professional life in the capital over 15 years. She said she was careful about people because she had learned that trust was something you gave once, and either confirmed or regretted. I told her I had learned the same thing. I told her about Eleanor, briefly, not in a way that invited sympathy, but just as information about who I was. She received it without drama, and without the kind of performed empathy that makes grief feel like a performance. She just nodded and said, "She sounds like she was very exact about things." I asked what she meant. She said, "The way you talk about her." Like every detail of her was specific. Most people don't notice that about the people they love until they're gone. I did not respond to that immediately. It was the most precisely accurate thing anyone had said to me about Eleanor in 3 years. I extended my stay in Manila by 6 weeks, then by another 4. By the time I flew back to London in August, it was because I had commitments I could not further defer, not because I wanted to leave. Perla and I spoke every day after I returned. Not briefly, real conversations, long ones, about everything and nothing, in the particular way that a relationship establishes itself when 2 people discover they have more to say to each other than they expected. I went back to Manila in October, and in November, during an evening at the flat she now felt comfortable having me in, she mentioned her sister for the first time. "Sofia has called again," she said. She was in the small kitchen, and I was at the table, and her tone was the specific tone of someone managing something they are tired of managing. "She needs money for a medical bill. My mother's blood pressure medication has changed, and the new one is expensive." "How much?" I said. She shook her head. "Harvey, this is not your problem." "How much, Perla?" she told me. It was the equivalent of about £800. I had it transferred to the account she provided before we finished dinner. She looked at me across the table with an expression I read as gratitude mixed with mild discomfort. The discomfort of someone who does not like receiving help and is only accepting it because the alternative is worse. "Sofia will want to thank you," she said. "She doesn't need to. She will anyway. She is that kind of person." 2 days later, Sofia called me. Video call, which I had not expected. She was in her mid-30s, pretty in a completely different way from Perla. Where Perla was composed and still, Sofia was warm and expressive, quick with a smile. She thanked me with genuine-seeming sincerity. She talked about her mother's health, explained the situation in detail, said she hated asking Perla for anything because she knew how hard Perla worked. She said, "I am so glad Perla found someone like you. She deserves someone good. I found her easy to talk to." I found the whole thing easy to place. A younger sister in difficult circumstances, grateful for help, wanting me to know it was appreciated. I did not question any of it. Why would I? I had met Perla at Patrick's dinner. I had spent months building a real relationship with a real woman who had a real flat and a real job and a real history in a real city. The sister was a detail in a larger coherent story. You do not pull at details when the larger story makes sense. That is, I think now, exactly the point. Perla and I made the relationship formal, in the way relationships between adults in different countries become formal. We were consistent. We were committed. We talked about what the future might look like. I began spending 4 months of each year in Manila. I kept my Kensington flat for the months I was in London. I had the financial stability to do this without strain, which I was aware of, and which I think Perla was also aware of, though she never referenced it directly. She did not ask me for money for herself. That matters, and I need to say it clearly. In 3 years, Perla Dallasay never once asked me for money for herself. She was not that kind of person. I thought. She had her independence and she kept it. The money went to Sofia. Over the first year it was episodic. Sofia's mother needed this. Sofia's landlord had raised the rent, and she needed time to find somewhere else. Sofia had a small business, a food stall, Perla said, that had run into trouble with a supplier. Each situation was explained fully, in calls where Sofia herself would speak to me directly. She was always warm, always specific, always grateful. She would ask about my life, about London, about how I was finding Manila. She sent voice notes on occasions that required no particular reason. Just checking in, she said, because Perla had told her I was important to her, and she wanted me to know she felt the same. By the end of the first year, I had given approximately £68,000 to Sofia's various situations. I was aware of this figure because I tracked my finances the way I had always tracked everything. I did not think of it as a concerning number. I thought of it as the accumulated cost of helping someone through a difficult period, spread across 12 months. It averaged out to roughly £500 a month. For a man of my means, that was significant but not alarming. I told myself it was what you did when you were part of someone's life. Not just Perla's life, her family's. In the second year, the situations grew larger. Sofia's mother had a fall. Hip surgery was required. The hospital costs, with rehabilitation, came to the equivalent of £24,000, of which the family could cover perhaps a quarter. I covered the rest. A month later, there was a legal problem. A property dispute involving the family home in Pangasinan, which Sofia said required a lawyer and a settlement payment before a court deadline. That was £18,000. Sofia's food stall had to close completely because of a licensing issue with the local authority, and she needed capital to start a different kind of small business. This time a small retail concession in a market near her flat. That was £11,500. I want to be precise about something. Each time a situation arose, I spoke to both Perla and Sofia. Perla would tell me about it first, in the same tired, resigned tone of someone managing a difficult family member. She would never ask me to help. She would simply describe the situation. And then Sofia would call separately, explain in detail. And the detail was always good. Specific, verifiable seeming, delivered with the kind of practical clarity that suggested someone who was embarrassed to need help and wanted to demonstrate that they understood exactly what they were asking for. I met Sofia in person for the first time in the 14th month of the relationship. She came to Manila for a weekend to visit Perla, and the three of us had dinner. She was entirely consistent with the person I had known on video calls. Warm, slightly louder than Perla, laughing more easily. The two of them together behaved exactly as sisters behave, interrupting each other, finishing sentences, the particular mixture of affection and mild irritation that only works between people who grew up in the same house. I watched them across the table and felt, genuinely, the satisfaction of being part of something extended and real. There was a moment at that dinner that I have returned to many times. Sofia said something that made Perla briefly look uncomfortable. Not upset, just briefly careful. I cannot remember the exact words. something about a mutual friend or a shared memory that seemed to land slightly wrong. Perla steered the conversation away from it quickly and gracefully, and I noticed the steering and filed it as something unremarkable. Sisters have things between them that partners are not always meant to understand fully. I told myself that. By the end of the second year, I had given Sofia a total, across all the situations, of approximately £214,000. When I added this to the first year's figure, the combined total was around £282,000. I did not present it to myself this way. I maintained the individual transactions as separate entries in my records and did not often add them into a single figure, because doing so would have produced a number that required looking at directly. I was aware, on some level, that I was not adding them up for a reason. That awareness should have been enough to make me add them up. It was not. My friend Patrick, who had introduced me to Perla originally, and who I had continued to see in Manila every time I visited, asked me one evening over a beer whether I had thought about how much I had spent since the relationship began. He was not accusatory. Patrick was not that kind of man. He was careful and considered, and he had been watching from the outside for long enough to have concerns he was not sure how to express. Not on Perla, I said. On her sister. She has a lot of problems. Patrick looked at his beer. Have you met her, the sister? Yes, once. She came for a weekend. Just the once? In over a year? Perla says they don't see each other that often. Sofia lives in Quezon City. Perla's here. Different rhythms. Patrick nodded slowly. He did not say what he was thinking. I did not ask him to. There was a version of that conversation that I chose not to have, and the choosing not to have it was its own kind of answer. In the third year, the requests from Sofia became larger and more frequent. A serious medical diagnosis. Not the mother this time, but Sofia herself. She told me on a video call, her voice controlled but her eyes clearly upset, that she had been told she needed surgery for a gynecological condition that, if left untreated, would become more serious. The public hospital had a waiting list of several months. The private hospital could do it in 3 weeks. The cost of the private procedure, with preoperative care and a week's recovery, was the equivalent of £31,000. I authorized the transfer the following morning. 6 weeks after the surgery, which she said had gone well, and for which she sent me a photograph of herself in a hospital bed, looking pale but smiling, Sofia told me she was trying to restart her business, this time more seriously, a proper small restaurant rather than a stall. She had found a location. She had a business plan she wanted to show me. She sent it over, and it was detailed and professionally laid out. It showed startup costs of approximately £48,000, a projected return to profitability within 18 months, and a personal contribution from Sofia of around a quarter of the total. She asked if I would consider investing the remaining 3/4 as a loan, at whatever terms I thought were fair, repayable over 3 years. I read the plan carefully. It was genuinely good. The location made sense. The concept was specific and considered. The financial projections were not outlandish. I told her I would not call it a loan. I told her I would consider it a gift, because calling it a loan put pressure on a new business that it did not need. She resisted this. She said she needed it to be a loan, that she had too much pride to take that amount as a gift. We went back and forth about this for several days. Eventually, I agreed to call it a loan with repayment terms she was comfortable with, knowing, and I think she knew, that I would not hold her to them. The money went across in 2 transfers across a single week. By this point, I was also sending a monthly amount, $2,800, that had evolved gradually from a one-time payment into what I can only describe as an informal income. It had begun 18 months earlier when Sofia said she was between business ventures and struggling to cover her rent. Perla had asked, with visible discomfort, whether I could help for a month or 2 while Sofia found her feet. The month or 2 had never ended. I had not closed it down because every time I considered raising it, something else happened that made it seem like the wrong moment. Late in the 3rd year, I began to notice things I had been noticing for longer than I admitted. The calls with Sofia had become different in tone. Not colder exactly, more careful. There were moments where she seemed to be thinking before speaking in a way she had not before, as though monitoring what she was saying against something I could not see. Perla, when I mentioned this, said Sofia had been under a great deal of stress and was probably simply tired. I accepted that explanation in the moment and sat with it uneasily for several days after. There was a discrepancy in a story. Sofia had told me, in a call in March, that her mother had been staying with her for the past 2 months since the original surgery. Perla, in a call 2 days later, mentioned her mother had been in Pangasinan for the whole of March and was not planning to travel to Manila until the rains ended. It was a small thing. Families lose track of each other's movements, schedules change. I told myself this. I also wrote it down in the notebook I kept, where I had started, without fully acknowledging that I was doing it, logging certain things that did not quite align. By April, the notebook had 7 entries. In May, I called Patrick and told him I wanted to speak to a private investigator. He asked me why. I said I was not entirely sure, but that I had been feeling uncertain for a while, and I wanted to understand what I was actually looking at. He gave me the name of a man he had used once for a business matter. Ronaldo Espiritu, professional, discreet, based in Quezon City. I met Ronaldo at a coffee shop near Patrick's building and explained what I wanted. Surveillance. Specifically, I wanted to know where Sofia Reyes actually lived and spent her time. I said I was not looking for anything in particular. I said I just wanted to know that the picture I had was accurate. Ronaldo called me 3 weeks later and asked if we could meet in person. He did not say why on the phone, but his tone was careful in a way that told me to clear my afternoon. He brought printed photographs and a written summary. He spread them on the table between us methodically, without commentary. The way professionals deliver information they are letting the other person process at their own speed. I looked at the photographs in order. The first several showed Sofia at various locations in Quezon City, a flat building, a market, a coffee shop. She was alone in most of them. In the last photograph, the one he had sent me at 2 in the morning, she was at a restaurant table with Perla, not sitting like sisters. I asked Ronaldo how long he had been observing. He said 3 weeks. I asked if they lived together. He said his information suggested they shared the flat in Quezon City, at least 3 to 4 nights a week. He said the relationship he observed was clearly not a sibling relationship in the conventional sense. He said he had also found, in the course of his research, that Sofia Reyes did not appear in any records under that name in connection with the Pangasinan family Perla had described. He said the name may have been accurate or may not have been. He could not confirm the existence of the mother, the surgery, the property dispute, or any of the other situations that had been described to me. I sat with all of this for a long time. Then I paid Ronaldo, thanked him, and drove back to the house I was renting in Quezon City, and I sat in the garden until the tea went cold and the heat came in. I called Perla that evening. She answered immediately, the way she always did, her voice warm and easy in the particular way it had always been. I asked how her day was. She told me. We talked for perhaps 10 minutes about ordinary things, and I listened to her voice as I had listened to it hundreds of times, and I tried to find in it the thing that I had missed, the place where the script showed through. I could not find it. She sounded exactly like herself, which was the point. I understood now. Because the self she had always shown me had been a constructed self, built from the beginning to present the specific picture I would find credible and compelling. I said, Perla, I want to ask you something directly. She said, of course. I said, who is Sofia to you? There was a silence. Not long, perhaps 3 seconds, but a different quality of silence from anything I had experienced in 3 years of conversations with her, a silence that had weight. She is my sister, she said. Her voice had not changed. Why are you asking me that? I had someone watch her, I said. I have photographs. Another silence, longer this time. Harvey, I don't want an explanation, I said. I want to know if there is anything true that you want to say to me before I decide what to do next. She said nothing for a long time. Long enough that I checked the call was still connected. Then she said, very quietly, "I never wanted you to be hurt." I did not respond to that. "The money will be repaid," she said. "I swear to you. We can arrange something. Whatever you need." "How much do you think it is?" I said. She did not answer. "It is £525,000, I said, "across 3 years, in my records. Every transfer, every date, every account it went to. I have all of it." She said nothing. I ended the call. I want to be honest about what came next, because I think people who hear stories like this expect rage or collapse, and what I actually felt was neither of those. What I felt was something closer to a very deep, very quiet exhaustion. Not at her, specifically, at myself. At the 3 years I had spent constructing explanations for things that had been telling me the truth all along, and choosing the explanation over the truth, because the explanation was more comfortable, and the truth would have required me to dismantle something. I did not want to dismantle. Patrick came to the house that evening. I had called him from the garden, shortly after I ended the call with Perla, and said simply that the thing he had been worried about had turned out to be something to worry about. He arrived with food he had picked up somewhere, and sat with me in the kitchen while I explained what Ronaldo had found. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, "What do you need right now?" I said I needed to eat something, and I needed him to be there, and he did both of those things, without making them into more than they were. I went to the police in Manila. I filed a report with full documentation, every transfer, every date, every record I had kept with the precision of someone who had spent 31 years managing complex organizations and knew that documentation was always the difference between having options and having none. The officer I spoke to was professional and took the report seriously. She explained that cross-border financial fraud cases were difficult to prosecute quickly and that asset recovery was not guaranteed. I thanked her and gave her everything she asked for. I also spoke to a lawyer in London, by video call, the following week. He gave me the same honest picture in different terms. The transfers had been authorized. The avenues for recovery were limited. The case might progress. It might not. I flew back to London in June. I did not close the Manila chapter dramatically. I simply returned my keys, packed my things, and left. The house in Quezon City, the morning gardens, the 40 minutes of cool air before the heat came in, I left all of it without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it into something it was not. It was the end of a period of my life that had been built on a false foundation, and treating the dismantling of it as a significant event would have given it a weight that I did not want to carry. I have not spoken to Perla since the phone call. I have not spoken to Sofia. I do not know what became of them, or what they are doing now, or whether they have done what they did to anyone else, though I suspect they have. What they built was not improvised, it was practiced. The details were too good, the timing was too consistent. The way Sofia was introduced, gradually, naturally, never forced. And the way the requests arrived, each one plausible, each one accompanied by a real conversation with a person who seemed real, was the work of people who had done this before and knew how it worked. I know that, and I hold it alongside something else, which is that for 3 years I was genuinely happy, not deceived happy, where I was experiencing something false and mistaking it for something true. The happiness was real. It was produced by false circumstances, but the experience of it was mine, and it happened, and it was good. That is a strange thing to reconcile. The love I felt for Perla, or for the version of Perla I was given to know, was real love, properly real. The grief of losing it is real grief, which has no category, because there is no clean name for grieving someone who never existed as you understood them. I have been back in London for several months now. I am in the Kensington flat, which I am glad I kept. I have lunch with Patrick when he is in London. I have a former colleague named Barry who I meet for a walk in Hyde Park on Thursdays, which sounds minor and is not minor at all. Having one regular, reliable, honest presence in a week is more stabilizing than people give it credit for. My solicitor is still pursuing what avenues exist. I do not expect to recover the money. I have made my financial adjustments and I will be comfortable. Not as comfortable as I planned, but comfortable. What I think about most, in the evenings, is not the money. It is the quality of attention I gave to the wrong things. I was an executive for 31 years. I read organizations. I identified where systems were failing before the failure became visible. I had a skill for seeing what was actually happening underneath what appeared to be happening. And I applied none of that skill to the thing that mattered most. Not because I could not, because I chose not to. Because I wanted the life I was being offered, and scrutinizing the offer would have put the life at risk. That is the true cost of this, not £525. Though that is real, and it matters. The true cost is the understanding that the skills I most trusted in myself were the ones I most deliberately set aside. A con works not by overcoming your intelligence. It works by getting your intelligence to cooperate. It gives you enough to examine, enough to confirm, enough detail to make the analysis feel complete, while keeping the one critical thing just outside a frame. Perla gave me a real relationship with enough texture and history and specificity that my instincts told me it was genuine. Sofia gave me a real person to speak to, with a real face and a real voice and a real warmth. The only thing that was fabricated was the relationship between them, and that was the only thing I never thought to verify, because it was the thing that made everything else make sense. I have thought about what I would say to another man in the position I was in 3 years ago, a man who is widowed and wealthy, and lonely in the way that does not announce itself as loneliness, because it is too dignified and too well managed for that. A man who meets someone who listens the way very few people listen. A man who is quietly offered a life that is warmer and more present than the one he is currently living. I would say, the offer is not the problem. The warmth is not the problem. Loneliness is not a character flaw, and wanting connection is not weakness. Those things are simply human. The problem is the specific moment when you sense something that does not quite align, and you make the decision to file it as noise rather than nays. Signal. That decision is the one that costs you, not the one big mistake. The 100 small decisions to not look at the thing that is trying to tell you something. Verify everything that can be verified. Not because everyone is lying, most people are not, but because verification is not a statement of distrust. It is a statement of self-respect. A statement that says your resources, and your time, and your emotional commitment are things you take seriously enough to protect. A man who verifies is not a suspicious man. He is a careful one, and carefulness, I can tell you from the wrong side of it, costs nothing compared to the alternative. I am 73 years old. I have fewer years ahead than behind me, and I am realistic about that, without being morbid about it. The £525, the 000s is gone, and the relationship is gone, and the version of myself that existed for those 3 years, hopeful, present, genuinely engaged with a life I thought I was building, is gone too, in its original form. What remains is someone who knows more than he did, who has a clearer picture of his own vulnerabilities, who will sit in a different garden in a different city, if he ever does, and ask the questions he should have asked 3 years ago, not from fear, from the knowledge of what it costs not to. Eleanor used to say that the most dangerous mistakes are the ones you make while you are happy. I thought I understood what she meant when she said it. I understand it better now. When you are happy, the happiness protects itself. It creates reasons not to disturb things. It makes the questions feel like threats instead of necessities. And the person who understands that about human beings, who builds something that makes you happy before they build the rest, that person is using the best of you against you. The best of me was used against me for 3 years by someone who understood exactly what I needed and exactly how to provide it. I am not ashamed of that. I was a real person, responding to what I believed was a real situation. The shame, such as it is, belongs elsewhere. What I carry is not shame but knowledge, which is heavier in some ways and more useful in others. I am still here. The flat is quiet in the evenings, and Thursday walks in Hyde Park are honest, and the solicitor sends updates that I read with measured expectation. I am still here, and I know more than I did, and on most days that feels like enough. On the harder days, I remind myself that Eleanor was right. She usually was. There are things that come back to you in small flashes at unexpected moments. Not dramatic scenes, not the obvious ones, the small ones. I remember a Sunday morning in the second year, when Perla and I were sitting in a cafe near her flat in Manila, and Sofia called while we were eating. Perla answered, listened for a moment, and then said, with visible weariness, "I can't talk right now. I'll call you back." She put the phone face down on the table and said to me, "She always calls at the wrong time." I had laughed at that. I had found it completely natural. The mildly exasperated older sibling, the slightly demanding younger one. It was so ordinary that I stored it as texture, as color, as evidence of the realness of the life around me. What was it actually? A performance. A maintenance call to the other half of the scheme, conducted at a table in front of me, in the open, because the best way to hide something is not to conceal it, but to present it as something ordinary. I watched it and I filed it as ordinary, and I went back to my breakfast. I remember a phone call with Sofia in the middle of the second year, when she mentioned a friend of hers who had moved to Cebu and how she missed her. She talked about this friend for several minutes. Her name, her personality, the specific way she laughed, a trip they had taken together 3 years earlier to a beach in Batangas. She told it like a real memory. It was, presumably, a real memory. The friend was real. I have no reason to think otherwise. Just not the relationship being described to me. The context was invented. The history between Sofia and myself, her role in my life, what she was to me, and therefore what I was to her. All of that was the invention, laid carefully over a real person's real stories like a transparent sheet, so that when I looked at it, I saw the realness underneath and called the whole thing real. That is the craft of it, when I look back. What they built was not entirely false. It was real life used as scaffolding for the false parts. Perla's flat was real. Her job was real, I believe, though I cannot verify it now with the same confidence. The neighborhood she lived in was real. The restaurants she took me to were real. The stories she told about her childhood in Pangasinan were probably real. Sofia was a real person, with a real personality, and real memories, and a real warmth that I felt across 3 years of calls and 1 dinner, and 100 voice notes, that landed in my phone at times when I needed to feel that someone was thinking of me. The only false thing was what they told me their relationship to each other was, and that false thing was the skeleton on which everything else was built. I have asked myself many times what the version of events looks like from their side. Not to excuse it. I have no interest in excusing it. But because I am a practical man, and practical men try to understand the systems they are looking at, even when the understanding changes nothing. What I believe, piecing it together with what I know, and what Ronaldo's investigation suggested, is this. They were in a relationship, Perla and Sofia, that had its own life, its own flat, its own ordinary existence in Quezon City. Perla presented herself to the world of foreign men as available, genuine, uncomplicated by existing entanglements. She was good at it, because she was genuinely intelligent, and genuinely good at reading people, and genuinely capable of producing a version of warmth that was, at the interpersonal level, real warmth, not performed, real. Sofia became the mechanism for the money. She was not introduced as an instrument from the beginning. She was introduced carefully, over time, and established as a real presence before the requests began. The requests began small. They grew because they could. Because once you have given a certain amount and integrated the giving into your understanding of your relationship and your role in someone's life, the marginal cost of giving more is lower than the cost of confronting what the giving has been about. They understood that. They used it correctly. I also believe, though I cannot prove it, that the gradations were planned. The monthly income that evolved from a series of one-time payments. The business plan that was good enough to pass scrutiny. The medical situation that was serious enough to warrant a large transfer but not so serious that it demanded I involve myself in hospital visits or speak directly to doctors. Each element was calibrated. That is not improvisation. That is planning. And planning of that order takes intelligence and patience, and a kind of cold competence that I find myself unable to entirely not admire. Even now, even at its expense. What I want to say very clearly, to anyone who hears this and thinks that the failure was in some way a failure of intelligence, it was not. I managed organizations with hundreds of employees and budgets in the tens of millions for 3 decades. I read contracts and people and situations with a level of rigor that was professionally demanded and personally instinctive. The con did not work by defeating my intelligence. It worked by making my intelligence irrelevant. By surrounding me with enough genuine material, a real woman, a real relationship, a real city, real conversations, real warmth, that my intelligence looked at the whole picture and found it credible. And then keeping the one false element, the nature of the relationship between 2 women I knew, just far enough from direct examination, that I never applied the rigor to it that I applied to everything else. My intelligence was never engaged with the right question. It was engaged with questions like, is Perla real? Yes. Is this relationship real? It appears to be. Is Sofia a real person? Demonstrably yes. Is she in genuine difficulty? Plausibly. The question it was never asked was, is the relationship between these 2 people what they say it is? And it was never asked because I had no reason to ask it. The answer was supplied before the question could form. They were sisters. Full stop. Move on. Patrick said something to me, during one of our evenings after I came back, that I have thought about many times. He said, the thing about a long con is that it takes the same amount of work to maintain that it took to build. Every day they talked to you, they were working. Every call, every story, every warm voice note, all of it was work. I don't know whether that makes it better or worse. I said I wasn't sure either. I have decided, on balance, that it makes it something else entirely. Something that is not quite better or worse, but simply different from what I had assumed, which was that the warmth was incidental to the scheme. In fact, the warmth was the scheme. The work was the warmth. And because the warmth was real in its execution, even if not in its intent, the experience of receiving it was a real experience. I was loved, of a kind, for 3 years. It was not the love I thought it was, but the experience of it was not nothing. That is a strange and difficult thing to live with, and I am still working out where to put it. I have not gone back to the Philippines. I do not rule out that I may, eventually. Patrick is still there, and he is a good man, and I value his company. The country itself, the warmth of it, the quality of life at street level that caught me in the first weeks, none of that was false. That was the country, doing what it genuinely is. What happened to me happened not because of where it happened, but because of what I was, and what they understood about me, and what they were willing to do with that understanding. There is one more thing I want to say. Eleanor died in 2018, and I sold the house, because every room had her in it. I went to the Philippines because Patrick said it had given him something back. I met Perla because I was at a dinner party, and she listened in the specific way that Eleanor had always listened, that quality of complete stillness. And it was the first time since Eleanor died that I had felt recognized in that particular way. That is the honest account of how it began. I was a widower who missed being known by someone. That is not a character flaw. That is grief. That is what grief does. It creates a specific absence, and then it makes you vulnerable to anything that fills it. What I would want another man in that position to hear is not, be suspicious of warmth, or don't trust people who listen, or keep your distance until you're certain. Those are the wrong lessons. They produce a smaller life. The right lesson is more specific. It is this. When you feel yourself not asking a question because you are afraid of the answer, ask the question, not aggressively, not out of paranoia, just as a matter of basic self-respect. Say to yourself, I have not confirmed this, and I should confirm it, and then confirm it. Hire someone if you need to. Ask directly if you can. Find a way to know the thing that the part of you that is happy is trying to prevent you from knowing. Because the part of you that is happy is not always trying to protect you. Sometimes it is trying to protect itself. And there is a difference. And the difference is everything. I am 73 years old and I know this now. I knew it in the way you know things intellectually before. I know it now in the way you know things after they have cost you something real. The second kind of knowing is the kind that stays. 3 years, £525,000, and one photograph taken through a restaurant window at night of two women sitting in a way that told me everything I had chosen not to see. I saw it eventually. That is the part I hold on to. I saw it. I want to talk about the notebook, not the one I kept for the anomalies, the other one, the one I started keeping in the first months of the relationship, which I had not done since Eleanor died, and which I had not done for the 1 years before that either, because I had never felt a sufficient reason to. It was a plain black notebook, A5, the kind you buy at a stationery shop without thinking about it. I wrote in it most evenings after speaking to Perla. Not a diary in the conventional sense. No dates, no formal entries. Just things I wanted to remember. Things she had said that struck me. Places we had been. Small observations about the way she moved through a room, or the specific way she held her coffee cup, or the expression on her face when she was thinking about something she had not yet decided to say out loud. I filled about 60 pages of it over 3 years. I have not thrown it away. I have also not opened it since I came back to London. It sits in the drawer of the desk in my study, and I am aware of it in the way you are aware of something you are not yet ready to address. There will come a time, I think, when I open it and read it and feel what I feel. I am not in a hurry for that time to arrive. What I know is that the notebook was genuine. The things I wrote in it were genuine observations about a person I was genuinely paying attention to. Whether the person I was paying attention to was entirely who she said she was is a different question. But the attention was real. The noticing was real. The 60 pages are 60 pages of a man being fully present with someone, and that is not worthless, even if the context around it was corrupted. I raise this because I think it is important not to let the betrayal erase the experience. This is something I have had to work at deliberately. The instinct, when you discover that something was not what you believed, is to retroactively hollow it out, to say that because the foundation was false, nothing built on it had value. I do not accept that. The conversations I had with Perla were real conversations. The things I learned about myself in those conversations, what I still wanted from life, what I valued in another person, what it felt like to be genuinely listened to. Those things remain true even though the person who revealed them to me was not being honest about who she was. The self-knowledge is not contaminated by the source. It is simply mine now. I also want to say something about Patrick, because I think his role in this deserves honest acknowledgement. Patrick was the person who introduced me to Perla. He hosted the dinner. He cannot be blamed for that. He had no way of knowing what Perla was, and he is not the kind of man who would have knowingly put me in harm's way. But he saw things across the relationship that gave him concern, and he did not say them clearly enough for me to hear, and I think we both know that. He asked careful questions. He looked at his beer. He let me lead the conversations toward the conclusions I wanted to reach. I am not angry at him for that. He did what most friends do. He respected my autonomy when he should perhaps have pressed harder against it. That is a very human failure, and it is one I would likely have made in the same position. We have talked about it since, briefly, in the way that two men of a certain age and temperament talk about difficult things, directly enough to acknowledge them, carefully enough not to turn them into something that needs ongoing management. He said he was sorry he had not said more. I said I was not sure it would have mattered. That is the honest answer. By the time Patrick was looking at his beer, and choosing not to say the thing he was thinking, I was already 18 months into something I had decided to believe in. A friend's warning at that point would have been received as interference, not counsel. I would have thanked him, and gone back to Manila, and continued what I was doing. I know myself well enough to know that. The thing that stopped me was not a friend. It was Ronaldo and a photograph. Evidence I could not explain away. delivered to my phone at 2 in the morning by a professional I had paid to find exactly this kind of thing. I had to hire someone to make me see what a friend had not been able to make me consider. That says something about the degree to which I was committed to the version of reality I had built, and about how much scaffolding it takes to maintain a commitment of that kind. Barry, my former colleague in London whom I meet in Hyde Park on Thursdays, knows a version of this story. Not all of it. I have told him enough for him to understand why I came back when I did, and why I seem, on the occasions we speak about it, to be processing something larger than a failed relationship. He is not an intrusive man. He asks how I am doing, he listens to the answer, and he talks about his own life with enough honesty that the exchange feels mutual rather than one-sided. That is all I need from those Thursday mornings. The consistency of a real person, in a real park, at a real time each week, asking a real question and expecting a real answer. I think about what retirement was supposed to look like, and what it actually looks like, and the gap between the two. I had always imagined, vaguely, that retirement would be a kind of expansion. More time, more travel, more of the things that work had deferred. Eleanor and I had talked about it in the specific way couples talk about the future when both of them expect to be in it. Long trips to places we had put off, fewer obligations, more presence. The ordinary version of a good later life. Eleanor's death made that impossible in its original form, and the Philippines, with Perla, had felt like a different version of it that was still possible, still an expansion, still a life with more warmth and more presence than the Kensington flat and the managed days. It was not the version I had planned, but it was a version, and for 3 years I lived inside it with the investment of a man who has decided, after grief and adjustment, and the slow work of rebuilding something worth living inside, that this is what is available, and he is grateful for it. The version was taken from me, or rather, the version was revealed to have been constructed for the purpose of taking from me, which is a different and in some ways more complicated thing. What I am left with is the question of what version is actually available now, at 73, from where I currently stand. I do not have a confident answer to that. I have the flat, and I have Barry, and I have Patrick's voice on the phone from Manila, and I have the drawer with the notebook in it, and I have, if I am honest, a slightly sharper and slightly colder picture of myself than I had 4 years ago, more aware of my own needs, more aware of how those needs can be used, more aware of the specific texture of my own loneliness, and how quickly it moves toward trust when trust is offered with sufficient warmth. That awareness is not comfortable, but it is accurate, and accurate is something I value above comfortable, which may be one of the reasons I spent 31 years reading systems for a living. The 525 pounds is the number that the title of this story leads with, and it is the right number to lead with, because it is the measure of what 3 years of patient, intelligent, warm-seeming effort extracted from one man who should have been harder to extract from. But it is not the number I return to most often when I am alone in the evening. The number I return to is 3. 3 years. 3 years of daily contact with a person whose voice I heard more than I heard any other voice, whose life I thought I understood, whose future I thought I was a part of. 3 years of notebooks and morning calls and long evenings, in a city that genuinely is warm, and genuinely does have a quality of presence that I had not found in London for a long time. 3 years is not nothing. It cannot be made into nothing by the revelation of what it actually was. It is 3 years of my life, and it was, for most of those 3 years, the part of my life I most looked forward to. That is the part that does not fit cleanly into any category. Not loss, exactly. Not wasted time, exactly. Something else. Something that I do not yet have the right word for, and may not find one. I saw it eventually. The photograph. The truth. I saw it, and I came home, and I am still here. That is where I am leaving this.